And now, Leslie, if you can pin our panelists on the screen, we will get underway with the panel discussion. I'm going to introduce them as they speak so that we can jump right into the action. And I'm going to start with Doug Kwan from the Advocacy Center for Tenants Ontario to talk from the point of view of how the housing crisis is impacting tenants. Doug, take it away.
Thank you, Sean. It's often said that rental housing is a stepping stone towards home ownership. What tenants have been experiencing, however, has been affordable housing crisis that has existed even prior to the pandemic. This has made the dream of home ownership even less tenable for most low and moderate income tenants. From the 2016 census, about half of Ontarians pay unaffordable rents. And that's defined by the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation as having to pay more than 30% of your income towards shelter. It's widely acknowledged that the affordable housing crisis has only become worse since 2016. Addressing the housing crisis has become even more critical during the ongoing pandemic, as vulnerable populations who experience higher levels of housing insecurity and unaffordability have now been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Housing policies need to benefit those in greatest need, low and moderate income tenant households who have difficulty making their ends meet in the private rental market. For historical background, the governments from the federal and provincial governments used to invest in purpose-built rentals. And most of our existing purpose-built rentals or apartment buildings were created in the 60s and 70s. But that all changed in the mid to early 90s when both the federal and provincial governments decided to allow the private rental market shape the new builds for purpose-built rentals. They did so by incentivizing using the Residential Tenancies Act or rent controls to incentivize the creation of purpose-built rentals. What we've seen, though, since that policy was implemented in the 90s, has been that less than 9% of all new residential developments in Ontario have been for rental housing. Almost all new investments in new residential development has been in the home ownership front. You'll see that in the condo towers that are being built or in single family homes that are shaping many of our subdivisions and suburbs. Generally speaking, the Residential Tenancies Act is the central legislation that informs the relationship between landlords and tenants. It also speaks to how rents can increase. Generally, it is a consumer protection legislation that attempts to balance the unequal bargaining power between landlords and tenants by setting out rules such as rent regulations, as I said before, how tenancies can end, the rights and responsibilities of landlords and tenants. Generally speaking, Ontario has a rent control program that impacts most tenancies. It applies towards sitting tenants where their rents are controlled and can only increase by the rate of inflation in the previous year. However, there are two major exemptions to the rent control scheme. One being is if a unit has been vacant, then a landlord can charge whatever rent the market will bear. That's called vacancy decontrol. And until recently, any new developments that were created after 1991 were deemed exempt from rent control. So for 25 years until 2017, these newish buildings were exempt from rent control. So if you were to move in these buildings, the landlord could charge the rent to whatever they wished. That ended in 2017, but in 2018, there was a new rent control policy that was created for new units built post mid-November 2018. And the RTA, these rent control exemptions have had a significant impact on the affordable housing crisis. What we've seen in an era in which in affordable housing, where we've seen increasingly unaffordable rents and low vacancy rates, we've seen landlords resort to creative ways to remove their long-term tenants and take advantage of rent control exemptions. So you'll see this in rent evictions where landlords are trying to renovate their unit and have the unit vacant. if the landlord wishes the unit to be vacant for their own use or for the use of a purchaser. These are called no-fault evictions. There are penalties if these no-fault evictions were done in bad faith, but what we've seen is that it's really a cost of just doing business for most landlords. The penalties are just too low. Also, these matters can often be disputed at the Landlord-Tenant Board, which is a tribunal that hears disputes between landlords and tenants. But there have been challenges since the pandemic at the Landlord-Tenant Board, which has gone digital. And that has impacted people who have numeracy issues, who have issues with English or French isn't their first language, who have technological challenges. So what we've seen is that tenancies that would have been otherwise sustainable have not been sustainable, and people have been left homeless and that unit vacant to be open to the market. And so there's been increasingly loss of affordable units because of the challenges at the Landlord-Tenant Board. Thank you.
Thanks, Doug. Certainly some critical issues there. And I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa Brierley from CIRA to speak about the impacts that some of those lack of controls have on the housing market.
Great, thanks, Sean. So there's a lot to say about the issue of preserving affordable rental housing. I think just at the outset, I'll say that I think it's important to keep in mind that there's both public and private forms of affordable rental housing, and preservation is an important consideration as it relates to both of those. So I'm going to share a few pieces of information or data points in the way of context. Ontario has the second highest share of households that live in poor housing need in Canada. Those are people living in unaffordable, poorly maintained, or overcrowded conditions. Some of the provincial programs that help alleviate financial burdens for renters include below-market rental units, rent supplements for renters and housing providers, and rent geared to income units operated by nonprofits, co-ops, and municipal agencies. In 2018, these programs helped only 297,000 out of the 735,000 households that are in need in Ontario. And even among those who benefited from the programs, about 30% remained in poor housing need. In addition, between 2014 and 2019, all levels of government spent $11.2 billion on these programs, a significant chunk of which went into maintaining and retrofitting the various affordable housing stock that we have. But the province only contributed $1.7 billion, or 15% of that total. The feds contributed 30% and municipalities contributed 55%. So what this tells us is that municipalities and federal governments have taken almost exclusive responsibility for funding the operations of RGI units. In addition, operating agreements that underpin these funding arrangements and that have obliged providers to keep delivering affordable housing options are starting to expire. As a result, and with limited fiscal capacity to keep up with commitments, we've now lost about 22,000 affordable housing units over the last 15 years. It's also important to keep in mind that since 2018, the province and federal governments entered into a new bilateral housing arrangement, that would keep funding housing initiatives under the umbrella under the umbrella of the National Housing Strategy. And out of the $4 billion that were committed through that up to 2027, the province's share is only $1.1 billion, or 27.5%. And in addition, no provincial money has been put forward to contribute to preserving social housing stock, which means that municipalities will have to continue to pick up the slack on that front. A significant chunk of the new provincial commitment will go to portable rent supplements, but these will only work if there's enough rental supply, including affordable options that require continued investments in maintenance, retrofits, and social revitalization. So this leads me to my first specific suggestion, which is that the provincial government needs to be willing to spend money on this problem. We need to start speaking up about how the government should maximize, or at the very least increase, its use of resources to help preserve affordable housing. A good starting point would be to set a more ambitious set of targets that are driven by core housing need and broken down in more granular detail. For example, we need dedicated funds to ensure that older towers built before 1985 are well maintained. There's room to debate where the revenue should come from, but we need to get serious about increasing provincial investment if we want to maintain our limited affordable housing supply. And even the province's own Financial Accountability Office suggests that the current funding commitments are not adequate. Another significant issue is our rent regulation regime, which is placing immense pressure on existing affordable housing stock. For example, vacancy decontrol has incentivized landlords to significantly increase rents, including by actively pushing lower income tenants out of their homes, as Doug has already mentioned. This is quite pronounced in financialized environments where we've seen real estate income trusts take over older buildings, renovate them, and turn over the tenants in the building. We also need to stop kidding ourselves that deregulation automatically leads to more affordable housing stock. It's not a given because private sector actors will always seek to maximize their profits, and it's no different in the housing sector than any other. So if we don't want private market actors to behave like private market actors exclusively, we need to find ways to limit their behavior through regulation. Given that we want to strike a balance between incentivizing new affordable housing supply and preserving existing stock, we need to think about regulations in a strategic and coordinated manner. Vacancy decontrol, for example, could be removed specifically for legacy towers, coupled with increased investments to maintain the existing stock. In approaching regulatory change, the province must take a collaborative approach, and in particular with municipalities. We've seen a very fraught relationship unfold over the last few years, as seen in the liberal use of ministerial zoning orders that often override municipal decisions. This is unhelpful in creating the kinds of collaborative relationships that are required to address this issue. Much of the work to preserve affordable housing is within the purview of municipalities, which invest in repairs and create bylaws regulating demolition and replacement. Unfortunately, some of the recommendations in the most recent Housing Task Force report seem to imply a watered-down role for municipalities. At the same time, proposals like those that would permit as-of-right zoning for multi-tenant houses hold promise, but can only move forward with buy-in from local governments. The last point I want to make very briefly, because I know I'm running out of time, the province should look to empower municipalities, including in their efforts to invest in preservation of affordable housing. Toronto's efforts to acquire at-risk private rentals through the new multi-unit residential acquisition program is a great example of what can be done by municipalities. It's currently underfunded and could benefit from provincial support. There's other important innovations happening at the local level that could be replicated elsewhere throughout the province, including Toronto's redefinition of affordability as income-based as a great example. I'll leave it at that. I know there's a lot to say about this issue, so thanks so much, and looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say.
Thanks, Alyssa. That was an incredibly rich account of where we stand in the public policy environment. I want to jump to Gautam Mukherjee, who is the CEO of Mainstay Housing, one of the province's larger affordable housing nonprofit providers, to talk a little bit about how we get affordable housing for people. Gautam.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I'm the executive director, not a chief, at HouseLink and Mainstay. And for those who don't know, lots of friends here on the call, it's great to see you all. We're in the supportive housing space. So our tenants are people coming with mental health and addictions issues and experience of homelessness. So I was going to also talk, and thanks for the intro, Sean. I was also going to talk about the Housing Affordability Task Force in my remarks. And so just in general, or to start at a high level, I think the province, and it may not be just one party, maybe others are part of this too, have allowed the discourse to get sort of focused into a diametric of supply versus demand. And they're sort of solely focused on supply. And by the way, when they talk about demand, they're talking about people, right? I mean, supply, a supply solution, supply side only solution is let's just build more and more and more, and the affordability will take care of itself because there will be so much new housing. Even if that were true in terms of supply, I think we're probably a couple of decades behind that solution working. And then on demand, there's different ways to manage demand. You can limit the number of people around, or, you know, I think if we actually think about what people need, it's about not so much a demand solution, but a person solution to help people to afford the housing that is available. So it's actually about, should be about, in my view, about income support. There was a time, I think, when I myself started working in the space, and maybe even 10 years ago, where advocating just for better income support in the form of housing allowances or rent supplements or portable housing benefits may have been, sorry, my kids have just talked. May have been a solution that that could have had a greater impact. Providing providing people more money to afford the rent may have incentivized the private sector to actually create some more rental housing at a time where there was no production happening. And certainly the market rents, even with in Toronto, a vacancy rate of around 2%, may have been sort of more affordable to government. But everything prices have gone up. We're way behind on supply. I mean, ongoingly, but in the last couple of decades, the inflation on land costs, we've seen huge inflation in costs and construction costs. And now we've got rising interest rate environment. All of this has come together to make housing more expensive. And so the cost to helping people just on the income side has now grown, I think, probably to a point that most governments will not find palatable. So all of it is needed. I think some solutions on the supply side, but the problem is that that seems to be the only focus at least in the mainstream discourse right now. So we really do need to do that as well as helping people on the income side. The last point I wanted to make, I've got a couple minutes left. I encourage everyone to read the National Housing Strategy Council report, which talks about, I appreciate Alyssa's comments, but talks about how the federal government the program has not delivered what we needed to deliver in terms of core housing need and affordability. So housing construction does cost money. Our inputs tend to be some support from the feds. Right now, we're counting on the National Housing Strategy. The municipality tends to just put in some property tax waivers and development charge waivers. And then, at least at my organization, we do have some rent supplements from the province. Even with free land, we're finding that there is still not enough money to fund for the cost of construction here. And so we do need more funding in the system. It needs to come from all orders of government, I think. The province has been conspicuously absent in terms of funding for construction costs, although, and I think needs to do far more on the income support side as well. And with all of that, I think we may be able to get a little bit of more progress in terms of affordability in the province. Thank you. I'm out of time.
Thanks so much, Gautam. I'm going to go to Kaite Burkholder-Harris from the Ontario Alliance to End Homelessness.
Thanks. Well, everyone's a tough act to follow, frankly, because I think I may be repeating a lot of people's points, but I'm the executive director of the Ottawa Alliance to End Homelessness and one of the co-chairs of the Ontario Alliance to End Homelessness. So I'll speak a bit more today on what I've seen sort of hearing from providers that we work with. We represent about 70 agencies locally, and then I think well over 50 provincially. And a lot of what people have commented on in sort of the world of housing need is just the shift in the nature of homelessness and just a real increase in complexity for what people are coming into the homelessness system with, the increase in chronicity and how that basically has people getting stuck in the system. And the longer you're in that system, obviously, the more exposure you have to other kinds of challenges, growing mental health crisis amongst that. And we often talk about, certainly in my community, the kind of trifecta of crises. There's the opioid crisis, which has been going on long before. There's obviously the housing and homelessness crisis. And then we added COVID on top of that. And so, I hear from a lot of providers, people who had actually been doing really well in recovery for 10 plus years. COVID just kind of was the final breaking point for a lot of people who had been stable, who had been doing really well, who had previously been chronically homeless. And just the isolation in combination with all these other factors. And I mean, I think every person in Canada is stressed these days. I think that's the reality. But all those pieces just led more and more people back to the shelter system. And so when we look and think about supportive housing in particular for people who have those complex needs, it starts to change the conversation a little bit. And I think one piece that struck me is locally our largest community housing provider. So not supportive housing, but actually just social housing or rent geared to income housing. But they do not have 24/7 staff who are there for emotional support. They have gotten from like 30% of the people who were on the wait list being directed to their services to about 80% having complex needs. So coming off the highest priority list. So, you know, back in the early 2000s, it was more people who affordability was the key factor. They really needed social housing, rent geared to income. And now the way that our waitlist is structured is more and more people where they really need extended levels of support. And then on top of that, and I really appreciated Alyssa's comment, you know, we cannot expect the private market to like help and fix a human right? We have a human right to housing. Private market is never going to solve that on its own. And so I think the key piece is really making sure that we, within the nonprofit housing system, make sure that we're actually measuring the needs that exist and having proper needs assessments against what's being built and the services being developed. So for supportive housing, I saw some really good comments earlier, specifically about accessibility and what a challenge that is in terms of our even rent geared to income system. So starting to make sure that we're baking in those needs and matching, you know, household size, income size, particular needs that people may have to the type of units that are being built and to be built in a mixed context. So there are all those kind of pieces in terms of the complexity, but I would also say, you know, some of the solutions here, and I am very much of the supply side, but I think heavy on the nonprofit supply side, and some things that I think are strategic and can be useful. We know, and what Doug was saying too, the loss of affordable units through things like rent eviction and dem eviction, because we are in a lucrative housing market. Over, I think the last 10 years, we'd seen 15 cheap private market units lost for every one purpose-built affordable rental. So how do we get back at that? We need to start really focusing on nonprofit units that are not going to be up to the speculation of the market. I know that ONFA and CHF have put out a target of 30,000 new supportive housing units. And I think two pieces that may help in this, I hate to say inclusionary zoning, but the reason I say it is not actually for the amount of units it creates. It's the idea that if every developer is under the regulation of having to include affordability into the pro forma that they submit when they get a permit to build, you actually reduce the cost of land. And I know, Gautam, your comment about land increasing, that's the thing we need to target because it opens up space for nonprofit providers to also continue to get into the housing game. So that's why I say inclusionary zoning. I don't think it's a silver bullet or anything, but I think it may be one valuable tool to reduce the cost of land in general. And the other big piece I'll say, and okay, my time is over, is just the idea of cities actually buying basically buildings that are going to be turned over through dem eviction and rent eviction, and cities having a preemptive right where a private market residential building would go to them first with the option of purchasing it, and a city to then turn it over to a nonprofit. So thank you. I'm sorry I went over my time, but I appreciate the opportunity.
A little over your time, but great points and really, really useful data and information there. I'm just going to jump to Simone Swall now from the Cooperative Housing Federation. Simone.
Thanks so much for having me, Sean, and everyone here. So much to build on. So one perspective I want to add to this, because I would reiterate everything that Kaite said, and Gautam and Elisa and Doug. They're all such important perspectives to this conversation. Is the importance of our existing social housing supply and ensuring that it is still there for us and able to provide quality and good quality homes for those who need it. So one issue that's coming up in Ontario that maybe is kind of less well known, but was touched on earlier, is a number of our housing providers are reaching the end of their mortgage or end of their operating agreements. And for those that are reaching the end of their operating agreements, the funding for rental assistance may not continue, but they're in fairly strong financial state, relatively, depends provider by provider, but they can continue to operate as a nonprofit housing provider usually. That's not going to be the case potentially for the co-ops and nonprofits that are reaching the end of their mortgage. So about 80,000 units of affordable housing in Ontario. For our perspective, 20,000 of those, 75% of these households are on rent guaranteed income assistance. They're housing our most vulnerable Ontarians and communities across the province. When their mortgage ends, their current funding formula will basically strip them of all rental assistance that they currently receive, and it's going to put them into financial crisis. And we do not have a resolution at this moment of what's going to happen going forward. So we are really facing this cliff. Over the next 10 years, all of these providers are going to reach the end of their mortgage. And if there's not a reasonable solution, what we can see is that we're going to see the deterioration of these housing. And this really is the backbone of our social housing. It makes up about 30% of the entire social housing system in Ontario. So we really need to see a solution for these co-ops and nonprofits that are found in every community all across the province. But beyond that, we want to see an environment where these communities can actually grow. So to the points that were made earlier, we know in Toronto, or the kind of the GTA, 0.2% of rental housing, purpose-built rental housing in the GTA area is affordable to the lowest 20% of households, renter household incomes. Like, that is such a massive disconnect. And that is not the natural state of things. In Montreal, it's 15% of purpose-built rental housing is affordable to the lowest 20 income. And in Calgary, it's 11%. But what we've seen in Ontario is just a massive disconnect. And there are probably a number of reasons for this. Some of this definitely, there is a market supply issue, but there is a massive nonprofit co-op housing affordable supply issue as well. And to go back to what was spoken of earlier. So if we're going to try to get building again, not only does there need to be more investment, we actually need to help and support these co-ops and nonprofits to be successful communities. And that is something that we haven't seen in Ontario. And we have seen, the current funding formulas have just barely kept these organizations going. They have underfunded the capital for many, many years. We need to be setting up a program that supports success so that these buildings can grow, communities can grow, and start addressing the massive backlog we see. So right now, we mentioned earlier, 211,000 people are 211,000 people are on social housing wait lists. We know the core housing need is 735,000 people in Ontario. We are not going to get out of this crisis unless we start getting really aggressive in what our housing development is for low-income folks. So I'm getting lots of flares that I'm also reaching the end of my time. But, we cannot forget about our existing stock. It is there, it's serving people who are very vulnerable in communities. We need to make sure it's protected. And then we need to set these communities up for success to build.
Thanks, Simone. Really appreciate it. We are over time a little, but not a lot, to my great surprise. So thanks to everyone for packing so much great information into such a tight time frame. I spend a lot of time thinking and reading and talking about affordable housing, and I learned things today that I didn't already know. So really wonderful, rich presentations from our panelists. Our panelists are going to do their best to stick around as much as they can and drop into some of the breakout rooms. But we want to move away from what we've been doing so far, which is mostly talking, and get into the stage where we get to do some listening. We've heard a lot about places where the province can play a bigger role and a more direct role in addressing the housing crisis. And we need to think more about what we can do to help make that role happen. We have legislation rumored for this spring. We have regulations that are already in discussion at Queen's Park. We have a task force report that's dominating the conversation right now, and we have municipalities getting ready to respond to all of that. So the important part of this work is to make sure that you all get a chance to have a conversation amongst yourselves about how to tackle that. What are the things that we've talked about today, or the things we didn't talk about today, that are critical priorities for the folks that you serve? And where are there opportunities to address those in the current public policy environment? And what kinds of actions can we take to try and make sure that those get addressed?